A confidential report, allegedly leaked from Deutsche Bank, has ignited a wave of political turbulence across the United States and beyond. According to the document, Donald Trump is claimed to have used an intricate network of financial arrangements to safeguard his personal wealth, moves that, if true, could reshape the global conversation around power, markets, and geopolitical incentives. In Washington, members of Congress reacted sharply, suggesting that such a leak, regardless of its authenticity, raises profound questions about transparency and financial influence during an election cycle. Several congressional leaders called for immediate hearings, arguing that the potential implications for national security and economic stability are too significant to ignore. Meanwhile, international observers voiced concerns that the alleged financial structures detailed in the report could destabilize foreign markets. Analysts in Europe and Asia warned that even the perception of such tactics might encourage other political actors around the world to pursue similar methods, further blurring the line between public power and private financial engineering. As the story spread, media outlets struggled to verify the authenticity of the leaked report. Some networks suggested the document could be part of a coordinated misinformation campaign aimed at influencing voter behavior, while others argued that the level of detail within the report points to a genuine internal leak. Across financial markets, investors responded with uncertainty. Equity futures dipped as traders braced for potential regulatory responses, while commodities showed mixed movement as analysts attempted to determine how the alleged revelations might affect U.S. economic stability in the coming months. Through it all, Ray Dalio would emphasize one central point. Whenever political power intersects with complex financial structures, the system becomes inherently fragile. Whether this report turns out to be true or not, the reaction alone highlights how sensitive global markets are to any signal suggesting hidden leverage or undisclosed financial motives within political leadership. As the political and financial spheres continued processing the alleged Deutsche Bank leak, reactions across Washington intensified, following a pattern similar to the initial shockwave, but escalating in depth and urgency. Just as in the early days of the controversy, the first major movement came from Congress. Several lawmakers issued updated statements attempting to recalibrate their positions as new rumors and unverified claims circulated. Members of both parties urged caution while simultaneously calling for greater transparency, creating a paradoxical mix of restraint and pressure. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell addressed reporters once again, expressing growing concern that the developing narrative, regardless of authenticity, could influence political dynamics in key battleground states. We're dealing with a rapidly evolving situation, he said. If additional financial pathways are implicated, this could have consequences beyond any one individual. Following McConnell's remarks, various political commentators expanded on the possibility that the alleged financial networks could intersect with broader international interests. Analysts appearing on MSNBC and CNN suggested that the next phase might involve tracing the purported relationships to offshore entities or foreign capital flows. Building on earlier comments, investigative journalist David Korn stated that if the network described in the alleged leak was accurate, it could open the door to legal reviews spanning multiple jurisdictions. This is the kind of structure that, if real, raises questions at the intersection of politics, finance, and national security, he explained. Meanwhile, House Republicans seized on shifting narratives to argue that Democrats were attempting to control the political fallout. Statements from conservative lawmakers claimed that the silence of certain Democratic leaders indicated deeper concerns, though these claims remained entirely speculative. Senator Jeff Merkley reiterated his earlier call for clarity, arguing that U.S. financial institutions might have missed or ignored critical indicators. He stated that Congress had reached the point where a more formal briefing might be necessary. In parallel, attention once again turned to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. Their continued refusal to comment fueled additional speculation that internal assessments were underway. Former prosecutors appearing on major networks noted that SDNY often evaluates politically sensitive matters quietly before deciding whether public action is warranted. As in the earlier stages, multiple political figures cautioned the public against overreacting. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries emphasized the importance of measured judgment, warning that misinformation spreads far more rapidly during election cycles. At the same time, YouGov released another speculative poll, this one showing a measurable increase in the number of respondents expressing concern about undisclosed financial networks involving political figures. Analysts stressed that even without confirmation, public sentiment had begun shifting in a statistically significant way. International markets also reflected the building tension. Financial sectors tied to U.S. regulatory environments displayed heightened volatility, and European markets experienced short-term fluctuations linked to concerns about possible cross-border regulatory responses. In a development reminiscent of the reactions earlier in the saga, Elon Musk issued a second public statement. This time he warned that unresolved ambiguity surrounding the alleged leak could destabilize investor confidence far beyond the political realm. If global finance begins pricing in political uncertainty as systemic risk, he said the consequences could be far greater than anyone anticipates. Following Musk's remarks, U.S. Senator John Thune said the allegations represented a serious matter requiring bipartisan stability. Senator Joni Ernst echoed the sentiment, insisting that Congress must address the growing perception of institutional vulnerability. House Speaker Mike Johnson reiterated that maintaining trust in government processes was crucial. He urged congressional leaders to work together to prevent further deterioration of public confidence. Meanwhile, policy analysts warned that unless a conclusive statement emerged soon, either confirming or disproving the authenticity of the alleged document, the uncertainty could begin affecting midterm economic planning. At this stage, I, Ray Dalio, step back to examine the situation from a systemic viewpoint. This is the classic second phase of a narrative-driven cycle, I explained. Once the initial shock fades, what comes next is amplification, an environment where institutions react to the reactions of other institutions. That's when complexity replaces clarity. I noted that such phases often produce distortions in both political and financial decision-making. It's not the document itself driving events anymore, I said. It's the network of assumptions built around the possibility of the document. Amid the growing noise, one truth became increasingly clear. The momentum of the story now had a life of its own. Politicians, journalists, markets, and global observers were all responding not to evidence, but to the fear of what evidence might eventually emerge. As the political environment continued tightening around the alleged Deutsche Bank leak, Washington entered a new phase of coordinated messaging and increasingly urgent questions. The temperature in Congress rose noticeably, mirroring the early sequences of the controversy, but now, with heavier stakes and far more urgency, the first movement once again came from Capitol Hill. A group of bipartisan lawmakers issued a joint statement expressing growing concern about the persistent lack of clarity surrounding the claims. While their wording refrained from suggesting wrongdoing, the message indicated frustration that no official body had yet taken responsibility for clarifying the situation. Shortly afterward, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell addressed the issue a third time, noting that the narrative had expanded far beyond its origins. This is no longer about a single document, he said. It's about the cumulative effect on institutional trust. If unresolved, the implications could reach into the electoral framework itself. McConnell's remarks were amplified across major media networks, pushing the story deeper into the national consciousness. Political analysts on MSNBC and CNN began debating whether Congress might be forced into a formalized inquiry simply to restore public confidence, regardless of whether the document was authentic. Following this, investigative journalist David Corn appeared once more, stating the situation had entered what he termed the institutional discomfort zone. He argued that the overlapping silence from federal agencies suggested internal deliberations that had not yet reached public visibility. When multiple agencies avoid commenting, that usually means they're attempting to understand the contours of a potential issue before stepping forward, Corn explained. In a parallel development, conservative representatives in the House repeated claims that Democratic leadership had been slow to respond because they feared wider political fallout. These claims were again entirely speculative, but they echoed the partisan lines drawn earlier in the controversy. Senator Jeff Merkley renewed his call for a full Senate briefing, emphasizing that fragmented reactions were fueling more confusion than clarity. We need coordinated information, he said. Silence is not serving the public interest. Meanwhile, attention circled back to the Southern District of New York. SDNY officials maintained complete silence, but former federal prosecutors appearing on media panels noted that the persistence of the silence indicated that the office had not yet dismissed the matter internally. One former prosecutor commented, "If there were nothing to review, they would have said so already." Additional public figures warned against premature judgment. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries reiterated that unverified reports should not drive national decision-making, but he acknowledged that the continued ambiguity had created conditions ripe for manipulation. A new polling wave from YouGov revealed that public concern had climbed further, with a growing percentage of respondents indicating that they believed some form of financial irregularity may eventually surface. Analysts stressed that voter perception was beginning to shift independently of factual confirmation, a dynamic rarely seen in such early stages of an election cycle. Global markets began reflecting this deeper stage of uncertainty. European financial institutions adjusted risk models, Asian markets saw momentary liquidity drops, and analysts reported heightened sensitivity to U.S. political data across multiple asset classes. Bond markets saw unusual defensive positioning, suggesting investors were preparing for prolonged ambiguity. In the private sector, Elon Musk issued another brief public comment stating that prolonged institutional silence could provoke systemic instability. Markets tolerate volatility, he said. What they cannot tolerate is uncertainty without duration. Following Musk's remarks, Senator John Thune stated that institutional confidence was now at stake, not merely political narratives. Senator Joni Ernst added that Congress might soon need to form a bipartisan working group to address growing concerns. Speaker Mike Johnson emphasized that if answers did not emerge soon, political polarization could intensify in ways that would affect national governance. Against this deepening backdrop, think tanks and policy centers quietly accelerated their internal analyses. Their early warning assessments suggested that prolonged ambiguity could have medium-term consequences for international lending confidence tied to U.S. political risk factors. At this point, Ray Dalio, examined the situation through the lens of long-term cycle behavior. What we're seeing now is the transition from narrative volatility to institutional strain, I explained. This is typically the third stage, where political actors, markets, and global institutions begin preparing for the possibility that uncertainty itself becomes the central event. I noted that once systems begin pricing in the duration of uncertainty rather than the content of the uncertainty, the consequences compound. We are approaching a point where the reaction to the unknown may become more impactful than the unknown itself. As the situation entered yet another escalation phase, Washington found itself caught between unanswered questions and mounting pressure from every institutional direction. What had started as a single leaked document had now grown into a broad, system-level stress test, touching politics, finance, media, and global markets simultaneously. The day opened with a new round of statements from Capitol Hill. Several senators described the environment as increasingly unsustainable, noting that the lack of official clarification was beginning to erode confidence not just in the executive branch, but in the entire political process. A bipartisan trio, Senators Durbin, Collins, and Young, released a joint remark urging timely transparency, warning that prolonged uncertainty was creating a vacuum that opportunistic narratives were quickly filling. Major media networks mirrored these concerns. Morning panels on CNN and MSNBC described the political climate as structurally destabilized, while conservative outlets argued that the issue had spiraled due to strategic silence from institutions that should have clarified it. Early, across the board, commentators agreed on only one point. The situation was no longer simply about the alleged document, but about the failure of institutions to address it. Shortly after, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse pushed for a classified briefing, stressing that the Senate Judiciary Committee could not remain in the dark. "We cannot oversee what we cannot understand," he said. At the same time, investigative journalist David Corn made another appearance, explaining that the pattern of silence resembled bureaucratic freeze, a condition in which agencies avoid speaking until internal reviews are completed. Whatever is happening behind closed doors, he noted, it is taking longer than usual for a dismissal or confirmation. Tensions grew further when two anonymous Treasury officials, speaking to media off the record, stated that they were aware of internal discussions related to the matter, though they refused to specify whether those discussions involved the document itself or the political reaction surrounding it. This ambiguity only deepened the mystery. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries repeated his earlier caution, emphasizing that unverified claims should not dictate national discourse. However, he acknowledged that the continued silence from major institutions had created a vacuum of interpretation that could be exploited by both domestic and foreign actors. A new ABC Ipsos poll revealed that public concern had now surpassed a critical threshold. A majority of respondents believed the issue would eventually require some form of formal investigation. Election analysts noted that voter attitudes were beginning to shift in ways that could affect turnout models in key swing states. Meanwhile, global markets began reacting more sharply. Bond volatility rose to its highest level in months, investors hedged aggressively against political risk, and European banks adjusted cross-border lending exposure. Asian markets registered accelerated sell-offs in sectors linked to U.S. regulatory stability. Adding to the turbulence, Elon Musk made another brief public remark, warning that uncertainty is beginning to harden into expectation, a phase he described as far more dangerous for global markets. His comment was widely circulated across financial media. Immediately afterward, Senator John Thune warned that the longer the silence persisted, the more difficult it would be to stabilize public sentiment. Senator Joni Ernst argued that the situation had crossed into the territory of structural political risk. Speaker Mike Johnson added that if no clarity emerged soon, Congress might face pressure to initiate a bipartisan inquiry simply to restore institutional credibility. Policy think tanks, meanwhile, escalated to a new phase of internal modeling. Their assessment suggested that the uncertainty, if it persisted, could gradually weaken international confidence in the U.S. political environment, subtly influencing long-term decisions in trade, investment, and diplomatic strategy. At this stage, I, Ray Dalio, expanded my analysis to reflect the deeper historical dynamics playing out. What we are witnessing now, I explained, is the evolution from institutional strain into systemic questioning. This is the fourth stage, when the system begins to wonder not just what happened, but whether the institutions designed to explain what happened are functioning correctly. I noted that these phases are recognizable in long-term cycles. First confusion, then polarization, then institutional strain, and finally system-level doubt. We are entering that final phase, I said. When confidence weakens, not because of the issue itself, but because of the silence surrounding it, the system begins acting as though something significant has already occurred. By the end of the week, Washington stood on the edge of a new, unpredictable chapter. No disclosures, no denials, no confirmations, only rising political stakes, shifting voter sentiment, and increasingly volatile markets. And beneath it all, the single unanswered question remained exactly where it had started, suspended in uncertainty, shaping everything without revealing anything. As the controversy entered its fifth phase, Washington began experiencing a level of pressure that had quietly built up through weeks of unanswered questions. What had once been a political story had now transformed into a slow-moving institutional crisis, touching every corner of the government and the markets. The morning began with a new wave of statements from senators who, for the first time, hinted that Congress might soon lose its ability to remain passive. A senior Democrat referred to the moment as the brink of forced action, while a Republican counterpart called it the quiet breaking point of institutional patience. Major media networks immediately amplified these comments. CNN characterized the environment as institutionally over-leveraged, while conservative commentators argued that leadership's hesitation had created a narrative vacuum that now felt impossible to contain. Across nearly all platforms, analysts agreed that the lack of disclosure from official agencies was becoming more consequential than the content of the alleged leak itself. A short time later, Senator Amy Klobuchar urged the Senate to prepare for a closed-door briefing, stressing that the body could not continue responding to events through media cycles alone. That is not oversight, she said. That is reactive governance. Investigative journalist David Korn, whose commentary had become a recurring pulse point in the narrative, explained that the sustained silence from SDNY and other institutions was no longer typical bureaucratic hesitation, but something more akin to pre-decision lockdown, a phase that usually precedes a significant internal conclusion. His remarks triggered new speculation across political commentary programs. Meanwhile, unnamed financial regulators, speaking cautiously to the press, admitted that they were monitoring the situation for possible cascading effects. They provided no further detail, which only added more fuel to the growing uncertainty. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries repeated his now familiar caution that unverified claims should not guide national discourse. But even he acknowledged that the vacuum of clear information had produced an interpretive free-for-all that was increasingly difficult to rein in. A new round of polling from Marist revealed a striking shift. A growing majority of respondents now believe that Congress would eventually have to intervene, even if only to stabilize public confidence. Analysts noted that trust indicators were beginning to fall at a rate typically seen only during major national disruptions. Global markets reacted sharply once again. Bond spreads widened, currency volatility increased, and financial institutions in Europe and Asia initiated new risk-off protocols tied specifically to U.S. political uncertainty. The Dow saw an unusually synchronized decline across multiple sectors associated with long-term regulatory stability. Elon Musk weighed in yet again, noting that markets are beginning to price in the possibility that silence is intentional, a remark that instantly sparked debate. Some interpreted his comment as a critique of institutional caution. Others saw it as mere speculation. Regardless, the statement continued adding friction to an already unstable environment. Within Congress, senior members began speaking more candidly. Senator John Thune warned that the continued absence of clarity was opening a structural vulnerability in the information ecosystem. Senator Joni Ernst stated that the political environment was becoming strategically exposed. Speaker Mike Johnson added that the longer institutions withheld comment, the more likely it was that foreign actors would attempt to manipulate the narrative for geopolitical gain. Policy, think tanks, Brookings, AEI, CSIS intensified their assessments, now modeling long-term geopolitical impacts. Their internal notes suggested that if uncertainty persisted, it could begin affecting diplomatic perception of U.S. political reliability. At this moment, I, Ray Dalio, offered an expanded interpretation of what was unfolding. What we are seeing, I said, is the point where uncertainty begins shaping reality more than reality shapes uncertainty. In long-term cycle behavior, this is when systems begin bracing for outcomes that have not yet occurred. I explained that once multiple institutions, political, financial, strategic, begin acting defensively in parallel, the dynamic becomes self-reinforcing. Confidence becomes the currency, I added. And right now, that currency is depreciating. By late evening, Washington appeared locked in a holding pattern. Every major institution preparing for movement, yet none willing to make the first step. The pressure was no longer rising. It was consolidating, tightening, coiling. Something had to give, but nothing had given yet. And that tension, more than any document or allegation, now defined the entire landscape. As Washington entered yet another day without clarity, the atmosphere shifted from tense to palpably strained. What had begun as scattered political concern had now evolved into a broad institutional standstill, an unusual, almost synchronized silence that seemed increasingly deliberate. This time, the day opened with a cascade of statements from lawmakers who had previously remained cautious. A senior Republican senator described the situation as an unsustainable informational vacuum, while a member of the Democratic leadership called it a destabilizing silence that is beginning to resemble paralysis. Major media outlets latched onto these remarks instantly. MSNBC analysts labeled the environment structurally incoherent, while conservative commentators argued that institutional hesitation had allowed speculation to go from fringe to mainstream. Across the political landscape, one point became unmistakably clear. The absence of official comment had become the central narrative. Senator Chris Murphy, breaking from his typical restraint, stated that Congress could not continue operating without clarity on whether the alleged leak had any grounding. "We cannot legislate in a fog," he warned. And that is exactly what this has become. Shortly afterward, investigative journalist David Korn returned to the airwaves with a troubling observation. What we're seeing now is not merely internal caution. This looks like agencies entering what I call containment posture, where communication is frozen until a coordinated institutional response is developed. His comments reignited the cycle of speculation across cable news. Meanwhile, another anonymously sourced comment from within the Treasury Department stated that there were cross-agency consultations underway, though no details were provided. The statement was vague enough to change nothing, yet specific enough to intensify the sense that something was happening behind closed doors. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries again emphasized that unverified claims should not shape national discourse, but for the first time, he acknowledged that institutional silence had begun to compromise public trust in the framework itself. A new Reuters Ipsos poll revealed the steepest shift yet. A substantial majority of respondents now expressed concern that the situation had been mishandled at an institutional level, regardless of the document's authenticity. Analysts noted that this marked a turning point. Public perception had detached from factual grounding entirely and was now driven by systemic distrust. Markets reacted in tandem. Equities showed accelerated declines. Bond markets moved decisively into safe haven mode, and global risk indicators spiked. Financial institutions began modeling multi-week political uncertainty as a baseline rather than a temporary disturbance. European banks prepared contingency frameworks for cross-border liquidity tightening. Asian markets experienced synchronized outflows not tied to economic fundamentals, but to perceived U.S. political volatility. Then, as if to punctuate the moment, Elon Musk posted another short comment. When the silence becomes the story, the system is stressed beyond normal thresholds. His remark circulated globally within minutes. In Congress, high-level figures continued their increasingly urgent warnings. Senator John Thune stated that the silence was no longer tenable. Senator Joni Ernst argued that institutional confidence had entered a fragile zone. Speaker Mike Johnson emphasized that if clarity did not emerge soon, Congress might face bipartisan pressure to launch a stabilizing inquiry regardless of political cost. Policy think tanks pushed their assessments further, now modeling long-horizon scenarios involving not just markets or politics, but geopolitical alliances. Their internal notes warned that prolonged ambiguity could begin affecting how foreign governments interpreted U.S. reliability. At this moment, I, Ray Dalio, offered a deeper reflection on what was unfolding. What we're seeing now is the transition from systemic doubt to systemic preemption, I said. In long-term cycles, this is the stage where institutions, not just markets, but governments, media, and global observers begin preparing for outcomes before they are known. I explained that the longer an information vacuum persists, the more the system begins acting as though something consequential has already occurred. This causes a self-fulfilling shift, I noted. The silence becomes interpreted as significance, and significance becomes interpreted as risk. As evening approached, Washington felt eerily suspended, every institution bracing, none moving. Political tension had plateaued into something steadier, heavier. Market volatility had shifted from reactive to structural. Global observers were no longer watching events unfold, they were assessing the system itself. And yet, the central question, the origin, meaning, and authenticity of the alleged document remained exactly where it had been from the beginning, unanswered, unexplained, unchallenged, a void still at the center of everything. shaping the landscape simply by refusing to resolve. By the time Washington entered the next news cycle, the atmosphere had shifted from silent pressure to quiet inevitability. The political class, the media, the markets, and the public all seemed to sense the same thing. The silence was reaching its structural limit. The day began with another round of statements from senators who now spoke with a tone that suggested exhaustion layered over urgency. A senior Democrat characterized the situation as the longest informational blackout we have experienced in a domestic political context since the modern media era began. A Republican counterpart described it as a slow-boiling national uncertainty event. Major media outlets immediately seized on these new descriptions. CNN analysts called the environment functionally unsustainable, while Fox News hosts argued that the entire process had been mishandled from day one. Across the ideological spectrum, one theme was constant. Washington was running out of time to do nothing. Shortly afterward, Senator Tim Kaine stated that the Senate would be unable to responsibly plan its legislative agenda if clarity was not obtained. "We are flying without instruments," he said. "No responsible institution should operate this way." Minutes later, investigative journalist David Corn appeared again, his commentary now treated almost like a heartbeat in the unfolding crisis. "This pattern of silence," he said, "looks less like caution and more like unresolved internal conflict. That's when institutions stall, when different divisions have not yet aligned on the narrative." His assessment sparked new waves of speculation across all major networks. Meanwhile, a mid-level official from the Treasury Department, speaking anonymously, revealed that several agencies were actively coordinating, though no details were provided. This added to the growing consensus that something was happening behind the scenes, but what exactly remained invisible. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries repeated his now regular caution, but this time he acknowledged that institutional silence had become a destabilizing factor in itself. For the first time, his language suggested mounting frustration behind closed doors. A fresh CBS YouGov poll showed an even sharper shift. A large majority of respondents now believed that institutions were withholding information, whether justified or not. Analysts warned that trust indicators were beginning to resemble the early stages of political legitimacy erosion seen in other nations during periods of prolonged informational uncertainty. Markets responded accordingly. The Dow experienced a rapid midday dip followed by uneven recovery. Bond markets entered their most defensive posture since the start of the narrative. European banking institutions implemented new liquidity protections. Asian currency markets displayed synchronized volatility patterns, typically associated with geopolitical disruptions. As this unfolded, Elon Musk posted yet another cryptic remark. "When uncertainty becomes the norm, the system begins recalculating what normal even means." His comment trended globally, fueling another round of expert commentary. In Washington, senior lawmakers hardened their messaging. Senator John Thune warned that the institutional silence was creating secondary instability. Senator Joni Ernst argued that Congress was approaching a point of obligatory intervention. Speaker Mike Johnson stated that if answers did not emerge soon, public confidence will continue to degrade at a trajectory we cannot ignore. Think tanks intensified their internal modeling. Brookings warned that prolonged uncertainty could affect global strategic partnerships. AEI suggested that the crisis had entered a phase where international actors might begin adjusting assumptions about future U.S. political reliability. CSIS noted that geopolitical competitors could exploit the vacuum for narrative advantage. At this point, I, Ray Dalio, offered my continuing analysis of the unfolding dynamic. What we are witnessing, I said, is the moment when prolonged uncertainty becomes a systemic burden. In long-term historical cycles, this is the stage where institutions face a stress test not of power, but of coherence. I explained that once multiple institutions begin preparing for multiple possible outcomes without clarity on which outcome will materialize, the system starts behaving as though it is already under strain. Markets respond, politicians respond, other nations respond. Everyone begins acting based on the possibility of significance, not the presence of it. I emphasize that this dynamic is self-reinforcing. Uncertainty produces action, action signals risk, risk amplifies uncertainty. By late evening, Washington felt like a city waiting for an announcement that had not yet been written. The silence was still intact, but it no longer felt stable. It felt stretched, thin, ready to tear, and everyone inside the system seemed to know the next movement, whenever it came, would define the trajectory of everything that followed. By the start of the next cycle, Washington had entered a rare state, a suspended political atmosphere where every actor appeared to be moving cautiously, quietly, but decisively beneath a surface that remained eerily still. From early morning, new statements began circulating across Capitol Hill. A senior Democratic senator described the current environment as the longest sustained informational strain in recent congressional memory. A Republican colleague referred to it as a textbook example of silent destabilization. Media outlets immediately echoed the tone. CNN described the situation as institutionally untenable, while conservative networks argued that the lack of communication from federal agencies had allowed uncertainty to mature into instability. Across MSNBC panels, analysts emphasized that both parties were now describing the environment with the same vocabulary, a sign of convergence rarely seen in moments of political tension. By mid-morning, Senator Mark Warner issued a rare warning. Without clarity, the legislative branch cannot perform its oversight role. This silence is no longer merely inconvenient, it is counterproductive. Shortly afterward, investigative journalist David Korn appeared once again. His commentary now watched as if it were part of the official pulse of the crisis, introduced a new framing. What we're seeing now, he said, resembles a pre-decision freeze where agencies have reached internal conclusions but have not yet coordinated the public phase of the response. His words immediately ignited widespread speculation. Meanwhile, a mid-level Justice Department official, speaking anonymously, hinted that several agencies were aligning internal assessments, though the official declined to provide any detail. This vague admission only intensified the sense that major developments were approaching but had not yet surfaced. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, maintaining his cautionary stance, acknowledged that public trust indicators were now visibly weakening, noting that institutional silence had created a narrative vacuum that is now feeding itself. A new Pew Research Center poll showed a dramatic rise in the number of Americans who believed federal institutions were withholding information. Election analysts warned that this perception, whether grounded or not, was beginning to alter voter psychology in key states. Markets reacted in a pattern that had become increasingly familiar. Sudden intraday dips, sharp corrective rebounds, and an overall tendency toward defensive positioning. Bond markets saw their highest risk hedging volume in weeks. European banks implemented precautionary measures anticipating liquidity tightening. Asian markets experienced volatility spikes that analysts described as politically induced, not economically driven. Amid this turbulence, Elon Musk posted another brief message that spread across global platforms within minutes. When information stalls, speculation becomes the default operating system. His remark was quickly dissected by financial analysts. In Washington, political leaders responded with increasing urgency. Senator John Thune warned that the system was drifting toward informational dysfunction. Senator Joni Ernst said the prolonged silence was inviting misinterpretation at a national scale. Speaker Mike Johnson stated that institutional credibility was now being strained by inaction, not by events. Think tanks accelerated their modeling once again. CSIS warned that foreign intelligence services could interpret the ongoing silence as either strategic withholding or institutional uncertainty. AEI noted that prolonged ambiguity might begin influencing long-term geopolitical planning. Brookings described the moment as a multi-axis confidence erosion event. At this juncture, Ray Dalio, offered my assessment of what the system was moving into. What we're observing now, I said, is the inflection point between preparatory uncertainty and forced resolution. In long-term historical patterns, this is the phase where systems begin experiencing tension not because of what's known or unknown, but because of what cannot remain unanswered. I explained that when multiple institutions prepare simultaneously for multiple possible outcomes, the system begins acting as though a decisive moment is approaching whether or not the underlying issue warrants it. This is how narrative pressures turn into institutional pressures, and how institutional pressures turn into systemic reactions. By dusk, Washington felt more compressed than ever. The silence was still intact, but the equilibrium had clearly shifted. Every actor, political, financial, strategic, seemed to sense that the next movement was no longer optional. Something had begun to gather at the edges of the narrative, a quiet convergence, a tightening of unseen lines. The silence had lasted as long as it could, and the system, in every measurable way, was preparing for whatever would break it. As the global debate over the leaked Deutsche Bank report continued to expand far beyond anyone's initial expectations, the international community found itself grappling with a fundamental dilemma. How much of geopolitical behavior is driven by public policy and how much by private financial undercurrents that rarely see daylight? In the days following the initial uproar, European regulators announced that they would be launching an internal review to determine whether any of their own institutions had exposure to the alleged financial structures described in the document. Their statements emphasized that the purpose of such an inquiry was not to target any individual, but rather to ensure long-term stability across interconnected markets during an already sensitive global economic cycle. Meanwhile, several Asian financial authorities expressed concern that the growing uncertainty fueled by both media speculation and political maneuvering could trigger unnecessary fluctuations in currency markets. They warned that even unfounded claims, if amplified at the wrong time, can disrupt capital flows and undermine confidence in major financial centers. Across Washington, the political reaction intensified. Some lawmakers argued that the alleged financial strategies described in the report represented a systemic vulnerability that needed to be addressed publicly. Others claimed the entire situation was being exaggerated for political gain, insisting that the leak, real or fabricated, should be viewed primarily as an attempt to influence the electoral landscape during a highly polarized period. As committees convened and statements were issued, the public's attention shifted to a deeper question, not whether the report was genuine, but why global markets were so sensitive to the possibility that it could be. Debates erupted across news panels, think tanks, and universities, each offering competing interpretations of what the controversy revealed about modern political financial dynamics. Amid this environment of uncertainty, major corporations began issuing measured communications to reassure shareholders that the situation posed no immediate threat to business operations. However, behind closed doors, many executives privately acknowledged that the controversy had exposed how deeply intertwined political behavior and financial markets had become, perhaps more than previously understood. In global investment circles, analysts noted a growing divergence in market behavior. Some investors moved into defensive positions, anticipating regulatory responses that might tighten oversight across international banking systems. Others interpreted the situation as overblown, arguing that markets tend to normalize once political narratives stabilize, regardless of the initial shock. Throughout all of this, I emphasized a critical principle. Periods of uncertainty reveal more about a system's structure than periods of stability ever could. When an unverified document is enough to trigger diplomatic statements, market fluctuations, regulatory reviews, and widespread public debate, it shows that the underlying architecture was already fragile, perhaps waiting for a catalyst to expose its vulnerabilities. By the end of the second week, the volatility began to cool, not because new information had emerged, but because global actors recognized that prolonging the frenzy would only heighten systemic risk. Media networks gradually shifted their focus. Financial institutions stabilized, and political leaders redirected their attention to upcoming policy debates. Though the controversy slowly faded from headlines, its impact remained significant. It forced nations, markets, and institutions to confront an uncomfortable truth. In a world where financial systems and political power are deeply intertwined, even a fictional possibility can produce real-world consequences. In my closing reflection, I would summarize it this way: whether true, false, or something in between, the strength of a system is measured by how it reacts to uncertainty. And what the world just witnessed was not merely a reaction to a leak, but a reaction to the idea that such a leak could exist at all. The episode will eventually be categorized as a temporary shock, but the questions it raised about transparency, leverage, incentives, and global interdependence will continue to shape discussions among policymakers, investors, and institutions long after the headline has disappeared. And that, perhaps, is the most important lesson from the entire event.